Good afternoon, everyone. Depending on where you're tuning in from, a very good morning or good evening. I know we have attendees from, looks like at least 10 or 15 different countries and jurisdictions all over the world tuning in for this. So thanks very much for being here. And as always, a special thanks to our ACFCS members and our CFCS certified professionals out there who are joining us for this webinar, Know Your CyberCriminal. This is a topic of conversation that we've actually been having quite a bit, and I know the industry has been having as well, and that is how to use maybe different data signals than you've used in the past to identify cybercrime in particular, but financial crime kind of more broadly as well. So this is going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm excited to bring this to you and welcome you to the conversation as well. Please ask questions throughout the session. You'll see a Q&A text box. I think it's on the bottom left. Sometimes it moves around a little. And you can type your questions in there, and we will be fielding questions during the presentation. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. If not, we will also be capturing the questions and sharing them back in the chance that our presenters might be able to get you some questions offline. Either way, please, answers offline. Either way, please ask your questions throughout the presentation. Want to make this as interactive and as useful to you as possible. So encourage your participation. Just in case you're not familiar with us, this is your first time joining us. We are the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists, and we are a professional association that exists to serve you, the community of financial crime detection and prevention professionals in whatever form that might take. I know we have folks out there in anti-money laundering roles, cybercrime, fraud, some sanctions, really across the board, and that's by design. We are the big tent of financial crime detection and prevention, whether you're in the public or private sector. And we try not just to kind of, cover a bunch of different topics, but as much as we can, bring it together, look for common elements between different forms of financial crime, common vulnerabilities or weak points exploited by financial criminals, and collaborate to do a better job in financial crime detection and prevention. So we offer membership, which includes access to all of our webinars free of charge, as well as our webinar archive, a whole bunch of exclusive news, analysis, and resources. We administer the CFCS, or Certified Financial Crime Specialist credential, really the only credential out there that covers the full spectrum of financial crime risk. We have online training, and we also have been doing quite a bit of virtual events. I know some of you may have joined us for the Back to the Future of Financial Crime just a few weeks ago, and GeoGuard was actually a part of that event and did this session during that event, and now we're bringing it to the wider audience. So again, please visit our website to learn more about us, acfcs.org, if you have not done so already, and please get involved. With that, couple housekeeping and logistics notes. You may have noticed this is a browser-based platform. You're in your browser watching this right now, so that's probably obvious. If you run into any tech issues, audio, visual, sound cuts out, that type of thing, try refreshing your browser. That's going to be your first place to start. This can also be a little resource intensive, so if you have other applications or browser tabs open, close those out. That might help with bandwidth issues. You can also try closing out or rejoining this session if issues persist after you refresh. And finally, if you're not currently using Chrome or Firefox and you're having any issues, those are generally the recommended browsers, so you can switch to one of those. This session is being recorded. It will be posted to the site within 3 business days for ACFCS members. You'll be able to access that on our site. Go to acfcs.org. Put in your member credentials, and you'll be able to view the recording, a version of the slides, as well as get your certificate of completion there. Look under the View My Credits section if you want to view or download that certificate. Please do take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of this presentation, and please ask questions as mentioned. You'll see the Q&A box, and I see some of you already asking some questions, which is great. So definitely exercise your right to ask questions throughout the presentation. With that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator for today's discussion, Elizabeth Cronin. She is the VP of Government Relations with GeoGuard, who's kind enough to bring together this all-star panel and really run the show here today. So thrilled to have her. She was previously with the American Gaming Association, where she headed up their KYC and AML initiatives. Now with GeoGuard, taking a look at fraud and other financial crime issues and how to use some new data and advanced data signals to take that on. So thrilled to have you here, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for doing this, and I'll turn it over to you from here.
Well, many thanks, Brian. I really appreciate the kind introduction. Thank you to you and all of your colleagues and the team at ACFCS. We're delighted to partner with you for this afternoon's session. And of course, many thanks as well to our panelists and everyone in the audience here that's joined us this afternoon. I'm delighted to be moderating our discussion this afternoon alongside this amazing lineup of speakers who I'm very pleased to introduce. Jared Koopman serves as the Director of Cybercrimes for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Karen Boyer serves as the Vice President of Financial Crimes and Fraud Intelligence for People's United Bank. And my colleague, Trevor Wingert, is a Senior Consultant for KYC and Anti-Fraud Solutions at GeoGuard. We're going to focus our discussion this afternoon around some of the risks that are associated with anonymous activity online, particularly with regard to the customer, the client onboarding process that bad actors may look to exploit. We'll also touch on the role of innovation more broadly and how that can be used to leverage more effective KYC, AML, and sanctions compliance programs, and we'll also touch on how financial institutions can improve their risk engines and other fraud detection processes to mitigate some of the risks and threats that are associated with anonymous actors online. At the outset, just a little bit of background in terms of who we are and what we do at GeoGuard. We're a technology company. We're focused solely on fraud detection and cybersecurity with a suite of sophisticated geolocation solutions that ensure accurate, unaltered, and authenticated location data for compliance and fraud detection purposes. We support a number of highly regulated markets, both within the U.S. and abroad as well. As Brian mentioned, for everyone in the audience, really welcome your questions, anything that comes to mind as we're having this discussion. We'll be sure to answer any questions that come up during the discussion, so please don't feel the need to wait until the end for any Q&A. Look forward to that dialogue and feedback. And we'll also be seeking your feedback as well on some of the poll questions. So with that, looking forward to our discussion, and let's start out right at the top in terms of looking at kind of the current landscape, the current state of play when it comes to risks associated with anonymous activity online. Jared, would love to hear your thoughts to get us started here. Just, from a cyber threat perspective, what risks do you see are created by the malicious use of VPNs and other types of anonymizing devices, whether that's proxies or other tools that cyber criminals, use and manipulate to mask their identity, their location, and generally all of their activity online? Would love to hear your thoughts on that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and great question. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of risk, as I'm sure everybody on this event is probably quite aware of. The masking of the true locations and the individual's activities online really circumvents a lot of the common filters and common points of data that we're trying to collect or to screen for. And even within IRS as a company as a whole agency, this tends to be a significant challenge for us from our civil division for that same purpose. We're trying to screen up front for illegal activity coming into our networks and illegal or false filings that are being conducted with somebody asking their identity or location. So it's a common challenge. And then from a criminal standpoint, so the cases that we're working on, this creates a huge challenge for law enforcement. I mean, as one of the aspects of the criminal networks, that communication piece or that activity tracing really starts to be almost a dead end in some circumstances when you're starting to talk about proper technology being implemented by the criminals, whether it's VPNs, utilizing Tor, or accessing the dark web via those browsers. We really don't have the ability to get into encrypted communication or chat rooms. We don't have the ability to identify who's actually behind the activity itself. However, that being said, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, is that the positive component here is it really provides a false sense of security to the criminals. You know, they are protected in that one specific element, but they believe they can get away with much more. And there's a lot of other aspects that go to the criminal enterprise, and that's where we really look to exploit. And they really have to stay on top of their game all the time in order to get away with this type of, you know, any type of activity. So that's the good side of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's fascinating. Karen, would love to hear from your perspective and, you know, the role that you play at your institution and kind of what you're seeing in this area firsthand when it comes to bad actors or potential fraudsters and some of the methods that they're utilizing when it comes to trying to exploit your onboarding or your KYC processes at your institution. Again, whether that's through the use of a malicious VPN or some other proxy or anonymizing tool. What are some of the trends that you're seeing emerge currently?
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
There we go. Perfect. I was worried it was just me. That's great.
You can see my
no worries.
It really coincides with everything that Jared just mentioned on the public sector, but for the banks as well. It's really not just onboarding KYC. They're really using the same tools for existing profiles and accounts for account takeovers as well. Really, though, on the onboarding and KYC aspect, it really needs to be a two-pronged approach. IDV and IDA, which a lot of people use interchangeably, but they're really two different tactics that both need to be worked together and in tandem to get the full benefit. So IDV being identity verification. So does this information, does this date of birth, this social, this address that is being entered, does that match Elizabeth? And then IDA being the identity authentication. So it's like, okay, well, is this Elizabeth typing Elizabeth's information? You know, easier said than really able to implement. But as we know, for onboarding, the best identity thieves already know all the information to pretend to be Elizabeth if you're my target, or they're cultivated their synthetic ID long enough to appear to be a real person. And in both of the scenarios, they use these VPNs and proxies to really fabricate their location to match whoever they're trying to be. So we've seen fraud cases that, you know, we have IPs that are coming in from T-Mobile and AT&T. They look like legitimate residential IPs that are coming in, but they're hosted through a reputable household name VPN, which is really a bit new on our aspect. But they're matching the customer's address. But then after you take a little bit of a deeper dive into the logistics and the forensics of the device itself, the longitude and latitude of that device was in Lagos, which doesn't surprise you, but it was something relatively new because I'm familiar with the VPNs and the subnets and the corporations and servers that host them. But to see it come through as a residential common IP was a bit new for us. That was starting last year. So we also, without getting too technical though, in that same aspect, similar to what I was referencing, where there's some VPNs and subnets that were in companies that we're very familiar with. And a lot of times, you know, we match up the servers that are being hit by our customers with the fraud that would follow. So, you know, 149.50s, that's not real. That's just hypothetical off the top of my head. But usually you could see within a pattern they're going to be followed by a mobile deposit attempt or something within literally 6 hours. So you could be proactive in that aspect. But but we're seeing now that those 149s and those subnets that we're used to really looking at on the fraud side are now coming through as like AWS and Azure. And so even the bulletproof servers are getting more savvy and efficient. I mean, I don't blame them, I guess, but they're using cloud servers to just take that extra layer of, it's one thing to anonymize a IP to a VPN, but then to anonymize the VPN to a cloud. And it really just starts piling more and more hay on our hay pile when we're trying to find that needle at the bottom.
Absolutely. That needle that you then need to flag and provide to law enforcement as well as part of suspicious activity reporting for Jared and his teams. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Trevor, would love to hear your perspective on these issues as well. I know certainly you're looking and looking at these, closely evaluating all of these trends firsthand. Can you speak to kind of what you're seeing in the market in terms of the growth, some of these more sophisticated methods, but also the more widespread availability of this range of malicious tools that are readily available, they're out there, and how they're being marketed and advertised as well as a mechanism to aid with facilitating various types of financial crime? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So we're definitely seeing the use of VPNs and spoofing and that becoming more mainstream. And it's not necessarily for malicious purposes, but there's been use cases that have been emerging over the past couple of years, like using VPNs to do region switching for video streaming, accessing BBC iPlayer or switching Netflix regions. That's the starting point. That raises awareness, and something like 3 or 4 in 10 of internet users are using tools like this. And a lot over the past year, we've been seeing a lot more legitimate connectivity through VPNs, things that are making the signals that we used to see more clearly, more challenging to track when trying to identify fraudulent users. And then the app stores have spoofing tools and that sort of things for browsers and for mobile devices that continue adding more noise. So as IP addresses become less reliable, it's necessary to start looking at newer signals, more challenging signals, things that are there but harder to sift through in terms of the data that comes through our systems. The conventions of using GeoIP, as Karen and Jared had mentioned, just aren't relevant anymore, and that if you're focused on using that sort of data point, that you're probably doing more harm than good. And I'm sure that this audience is moving beyond that, but it's important to raise awareness and make sure that if GeoIP is a key input, that it is time to look at new data points.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it'd be great to get some insight from the audience on that note. Brian, if we could please tee up that first poll question for the audience with regard to what they see as the most significant financial crimes challenges today, whether that's transaction fraud, AML compliance issues, cybercrime or sanctions compliance, or account security. We'll look forward to hearing from the audience on that. We'll dive into one more question, and then we'll circle back to the results from that poll. Jared, would love to turn back to you and just hear again from your perspective, if you could speak to any specific cases in particular that have been resolved or concluded, any takeaways that you can share with the panelists and with our audience in terms of kind of lessons learned and recommendations that you have for the regulated financial sector in terms of detecting, getting in front of the various tools and methodologies that are currently being utilized that you see firsthand among cyber criminals and fraudsters. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it brings up a good common theme that I think we already talked about was, staying persistent, that the criminals are going to screw up at some point, and finding that needle in a haystack outside of the traditional data points that we typically would screen for. VPNs and any type of misattributable browsing is really just one component of the activity that's being conducted by these illegal organizations or organized crime groups. We're seeing much more of a crime as service. So you have, the hackers that are doing some of the work. You have the organized crime groups that are setting up the money mules, or the ones that are actually doing financial transactions. And then you have a host of other activities, whether it's the stealing of the PII or selling the PII. These could all be either related or unrelated organized, groups. So what we tend to do is if the communication aspect is really being masked, or we're having trouble or challenges in trying to identify any type of leads off of that, we look at the other aspects of either the distribution or the finance. And distribution, certainly if there's a good or service involved. Finance, typically in any case, there's that type of component that accompanies whatever the illegal activity is. And that's where it's great, because from a financial sector or law enforcement sector, follow the money, you're going to get to those that are behind that illegal activity. So our specialty is really focusing on, in this space, usually cryptocurrency or some traditional fiat transaction that's facilitating the proceeds or facilitating the crime. A couple that we've had recently that were really good successes that were probably highlighted in the media quite a bit that used VPNs or masking technology. One was called Helix, which was a mixer or tumbler that was online. And they were deploying both, VPNs and Tor on darknet marketplaces associated with like a drug marketplace, offering their service, which was a mixing, tumbling service for cryptocurrency, which then just, really makes it even more of a challenge, because they're mixing up the transactional details on the blockchain, which makes it very hard for us to trace wallet-to-wallet transactions. However, we were ultimately able to locate the wallet that was associated with that based off of following the final money trail and seeing the fees that were coming out of that going to an administrator wallet, which then we identified through other public information or open source data to identify, an individual living right in Ohio, of all places, running a $300 million money laundering scam. So that was one big one. Another one was the last one I'll talk about is Welcome to Video, which was really the first darknet child exploitation marketplace. They were selling, videos, child exploitation videos on the dark web, and completely being done, in cryptocurrency as the main facilitation of the funds. Luckily, we were able to identify through some very technical components, and I think Karen's already alluded to this. I mean, it takes time when you're starting to dig into the technical aspects that are actually associated with some of these groups hiding behind some of these technologies. We were able to look at net flow data linked with a lot of other information that we're collecting, both in our investigation, but through subpoenas and warrants, through open source data. Being able to look at that through an analytical lens across all of the data to be really to be able to identify that one needle. And that's exactly what happened. We ended up finding a file that was going back several years where the individual that was the administrator of this marketplace had posted something on social media on open source that matched something that we had collected in the enforcement activity. And ultimately, we identified him as a South Korean national. We worked with the locals in South Korea to actually take down both the server, the web page, and to make the arrest. And then ultimately, we've had, I think it's right over 370 arrests to date worldwide. Approximately 25 children saved as a result of that. Just an incredible amount of sophistication, and not to even mention, the guy was in his early 20s, that was running this sophisticated technological, marketplace. So, it's not just, the new wave of criminals has really shifted in dynamics.
Thank you. So there's such critically important issues, and really, Jared, appreciate all of your efforts on these issues, and appreciate you sharing that with us. Brian, do we have the poll results in to share?
Yes, absolutely. So let's go ahead and see the results for this first poll here. This one is, what do you see as the most significant challenge in financial crime today? And the most popular answer by a pretty wide margin is cybercrime. So I think that tracks pretty well with the discussion we're currently having. Yeah, about 45% agree that cybercrime is the biggest challenge. Transaction fraud coming in second at about 28%, with AML compliance at about 12%, roughly tied with account security from there. So yeah, and maybe not a surprise for our panelists, but absolutely cybercrime is top of the mind for the audience out there.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you to everyone in the audience that weighed in on that. We're getting some great questions coming through as well. So thank you to everyone that's sharing those questions as well. Why don't we'll kind of raise a few of these here. We have one I'll share with all the panelists, and you can take turns kind of weighing in on this. But the question is if someone can comment on how fraud teams are leveraging mobile phone data. And whether there's change in devices or carrier changes of the consumer, and really how they're utilizing that data from various vendors. I'm not sure who wants to take the lead on this one.
So I'll jump in as the FI, but it's almost a spoiler alert for something I was going to reference later a bit. But so it's hard to speak for everybody naturally, but I personally, just from some of the banks that I've been speaking to and just some info sharing groups with other banks, I think that the data that mobile SDKs, for example, can provide to the bank is really underutilized for authentication and other tactics. And again, that's just my opinion. But I think it's because kind of the same conversation that we're spinning off here is either the right people don't know how much data is actually being fed from the mobile app to their fraud tools or to somewhere, or there's a gap between the data that's being fed and the data that their fraud tools have. So ultimately, I think that, again, with this AML reform that's really focused on innovation, more just a campaign on myself as well. But I'm hoping that standard of authentication is risen, as Trevor referenced, away from IPs. I mean, FinCEN kind of just brought IPs into data requirements just a few years ago. And I think that that's a bit archaic compared to everything that we're talking about, and it really needs to start getting into the geofencing, geodata of the actual location of the devices. And with that said, obviously there are GPS spoofers out there, so there's always exploits, there's always vulnerabilities for good and bad. But they're most of the time within that session data that the recipient, which would be the bank or whoever is owning the app that people are logging into, most of the time in that session data, and I don't know the technical aspects, but there should be some sort of indicator that says a device spoofer is on the device or is being used, where, again, Trevor or Jared could speak more of the technical aspects of it, but from my understanding, even though as a bank or the recipient, you wouldn't maybe be able to tell the actual location that the device is coming from, you should be able to at least have some sort of information that some sort of spoofing is being used and use that data for a next step in the waterfall strategy approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jared and Trevor, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
Sure.
Sure, you can get in the government side. Oh, go ahead, Trevor.
Go ahead, Jared.
Okay. So yeah, from our perspective, I mean, a couple things. From the government side, we're in a little bit more of a unique situation where we don't really use a ton of collected, especially if it's cellular data. Just from, I think, from an optics perspective, we're not bringing that in bulk data into our ability to use for analytics. We only will tend to focus on when we have identified targets or individuals. Then we're going out and gathering, whatever information we can on either those specified devices or accounts that are set up. If we're onto a target or an individual or even an organized crime group, we can use certain types of data points, especially if there's like opt-in app data that has geolocational capabilities. But again, it would be under more of a legal authority to do so versus a mass collection of that type of data. There is a lot, though, going on in terms of the space because marketing firms are using this incredibly to an extent to really do direct marketing and direct type of pointed applications, so that when folks are using apps or even the banking, a lot of the financial institutions, if you have your own app that's being downloaded, that if the locational data is turned on and they're utilizing that either on a phone or an iPad or anywhere on a mobile device, it's collecting that geolocation information. So that can certainly be used for that purpose as public information on that end. And certainly something that, as we get into another discussion point, is, the information provided to law enforcement, that's outstanding information when we have a potential threat or something that is rising to the level of a suspicious activity. To be able to provide that information to law enforcement is invaluable because it's already putting us steps ahead in terms of location or, general information on that device. So, Trevor, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So when it comes to looking at location data, I think that there are gaps between what's available and what's actually being utilized by financial institutions. The risk tools aren't really even prepared for consuming this data, and that I think is a serious gap. That's why we wanted to make that point that geo-IP data, which is typically used in these fraud tools, is insufficient, especially with the rich data that is possible. And financial institutions, the banking apps, whether mobile or web, are not really collecting the data that they could. They're kind of limited to bank and ATM locator rather than using it as an insight that could be used for transactional monitoring for account protection and that sort of thing. So it seems like the technology stacks are not utilizing the information that's available. And I think it's important to differentiate between the marketing data that Jared mentioned and the way that a bank should be using this data. Like the data that's captured should be clearly communicated as the applications are for protection, for trust. That it's something that the bank and the customer need to establish that the data is being shared with the purpose that this isn't going to leak. It's not going to be used for insights beyond their protection. I think that's going to be an important step going forward. And things like Apple's privacy, nutrition disclosures for apps and that sort of thing should help develop that trust, but financial institutions need to go further in order to make sure that customers are comfortable sharing the information with them that they give away in a lot of other places, but seem hesitant to provide to financial institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much. Those are great points as well, Trevor. I think the discussion around, the risks that are at play, kind of the current landscape and the state of play has been fascinating. Let's jump ahead now and transition to the most effective ways to mitigate some of these risks and some of these threats, some of these challenges. Jared, if you're happy to start us off on this one as well, and you alluded to this in some of your earlier comments, but obviously we know a core aspect of the AML framework is ensuring that regulated FIs are providing law enforcement, providing the government with the most highly useful information pursuant to their SAR reporting obligations. Would love to hear your thoughts on your perspective on what really is the most highly useful information for the types of crimes that you're investigating, the most significant crimes, the most significant threats. What is that information? What is that data? Particularly, in the realm of creating efficiencies for you and in your investigative teams to grapple with these issues that we're facing today. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a tough one because it's one of those things where I wish I had that easy button to push that, everybody collect this and we'll touch them all, but unfortunately that's not the case because every circumstance is different and every transaction includes different points of data depending on who you're dealing with and where they're coming from and what device and things of that nature. So it's really piecing together a lot of the information that you can collect, and whether that's from a totality scope, whether that's, if you have log files and you're instituting some type of cybersecurity components, or, logging in net flow data, whether you have traffic data from, a traditional IP address, or even information about about whatever's coming in might be helpful, even if they're utilizing a VPN or some other component. Ultimately, down the road, it might lead to some type of data point that matches to something else that just triggers, some type of a lead. MAC addresses, account information and authentication, which Karen alluded to. I mean, anything you're doing up front on that type of an account detail provides information to law enforcement that we can then run down some of these leads. And it's also going back to that totality, you never know, one piece of data that might be siloed off in your collection that doesn't seem pertinent is very pertinent to us because it triggers on several other points of data that we've collected in our case. And a great example of that is sometimes if they're using an email address or a moniker on the dark web, and that same moniker is then used in some very obscure other aspect of some transaction. It may not be anything to you, but to us, it's the one piece of evidence that could break open that case. So, very interesting. Also, if there's any type of digital or cryptocurrency aspects or wallet information associated, that's always whether it's traditional transactional details or crypto type cryptocurrency type wallets or anything of that nature. That's extremely beneficial. And I went back to, my earlier points on the financial components being sometimes the heaviest relied upon data that we can find. But ultimately, the key is communication. If you find something, please reach out to us. We can help even in real time. If it's something that you have contacts through our agency or others, getting in touch with us, and there can be a back and forth, especially if it's under some type of a filed SAR or traditional other information just informally being provided. We can do work on our end and come back to request some of the follow-up documentation that might be associated with that information. It's just that close partnering that really offers a lot to our ability.
Yep, absolutely. That's really helpful insight. Thank you. Brian, should we raise another poll question for the audience, please? The second one that we have ready to go here. Around how the audience feels in terms of whether they have the right tools in place to detect fraud and some of these emerging cybercrime trends that we're currently seeing.
Yep, that poll is currently up on the screen, so go ahead and choose the answer that best fits how you feel and where you're at, and we'll let this run while we continue the dialogue.
Excellent,
yeah, and as
thank you.
And as we're talking through that, just a couple things to comment on that poll question. I mean, tools become very heavily relied upon both in government as well as the financial sector in terms of the mitigation and the monitoring. And I know there's been a lot of questions in the chat box regarding some of the tools that are being used, and y'all can look at a lot of the companies out there. And the reason those tools are so effective is they're living and breathing every day in this environment of some of the cyber components, cyber crime, cryptocurrency space. They understand the ecosystem. They understand everything that goes into kind of the flow of that information. And we rely heavily on them, multiple companies, to really both educate us, but then also to use their tools. So something to consider.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful as well. On this point, Karen, would love to hear your thoughts as well. What are some of the most innovative tools that you're relying on day in and day out? What are the signals that are really critical to you in your role and your institution as you look, every day to ensure that you're protecting the integrity of your institution and the role that you play when it comes to the integrity of the U.S. financial system at large as well? Would love your thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what everybody, Jared and Trevor, already alluded to, but really focusing back on the location data of the device that's accessing a customer's profile or pretending or applying to be the customer. And I know we've kind of went back and forth with the question that was posed, so I don't want to scale it back a little bit on the conversation, but I do think that it's important to bring up, as Trevor mentioned, one obstacle about that is the fact that banks simply don't understand the data that they're not using, or that the data, that not necessarily don't understand the data, but that they even have that data. Another aspect is that a lot of times the banks don't realize that data is housed on a third party and that they need to coordinate with that third party to get their data down to their front line. But a lot of discussions that we've had around it were really around privacy, and exactly what Trevor said. I mean, you have customers that they have no problem sharing their PII to download songs or to order a pizza, but then when it comes to like, oh, my bank's asking for my location, that's too much information. They already know about my money, and it's really the communication aspect of how to get the message to the consumer or the customer, stating, we're not looking to make an entire profile out of you, and we're not looking at where you go every Tuesday night or that you order Chinese on Thursdays. What we want to know is that is the person logging into your device you? Yes or no? Simply, I guess I say it so simply, but a lot of a couple other obstacles that are really out there but not spoken of is, sometimes it's not as easy as, oh, I found this data, let me flip the switch and have it feed into all my fraud engines. You have to coordinate the APIs and the communication between your login sessions, whoever the third party that's hosting it, as well as the fraud engine and the rules that come with it. And with that said, not every bank has the budget to update their app every 6 months or every year. And so a lot of that seems easy, but it's a larger project. So hopefully, if the larger picture where law enforcement needs this data to really figure out the money laundering that's occurring in the world becomes the soapbox that allows us all to really get on the same page and provide this data to not only our customers, but just to collect it without the worry of having somebody opt in, opt out. And I know I'm coming from a bank and from fraud, so I fully appreciate the need for the visibility for myself. I would want somebody to ask me, but I think it's more of, again, that communication to say, hey, did you know somebody was attempting to log in your profile yesterday, and they were from Nigeria, but they made it look like they were in your living room. It's those type of scenarios that I don't think consumers are really aware of how easy it is for the threat actors to pretend that they are them. And then also just to touch base on what Jared said, to wrap it back together, people always assume, like, oh, it's just a $500 Zelle payment. Oh, it's just $1,000 Square credit on from Cash App. Don't limit your SARs to large amounts just because you feel that that data isn't going to go anywhere. And I know SARs aren't necessarily quick and easy to type out for those reading them, for those submitting them. But at the same time, like to Jared's point, that could be the exact puzzle piece that they need to put together to find that guy in Ohio, you know? And it could be that moniker that he was referencing. Like they could have a darknet moniker on one of their forums, and then they think that they're being funny when they use it as like their payee name, you know, sending a peer-to-peer payment to themselves. And that could be that missing puzzle piece. So, so a little long-winded, but really don't hesitate on filing with as much data as you can. Don't think that, oh, well, this tiny little piece isn't going to really matter, because you don't know what the bigger picture is that's going on behind the scenes, and any information can really help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen.
Karen,
Go ahead,
I actually
Trevor.
have a question related to that. Your view might be unique from your position, but it seems that the larger the organization, the more fragmented the data is across the organization, and the less likely you are to know just what everybody is doing with that. Are you finding that there's any trend towards aggregating, or do you think that this is still a challenge with larger financial institutions?
Well, I hate to speak for the larger institutions, but to simply attempt to answer that, I would think that I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but similar to what we touched on before, I'm imagining that marketing of any business, not necessarily bank, but would love to get data about customers for marketing aspects. And Trevor, exactly to your point, there should be a clear delineation that this data is for authentication. And if we do have to do the opt-in, opt-out, then there should be two separate opt-ins. One, that this is to protect you, and then two, that this may be used for other purposes, which I would not click on. But you nailed it. There's definitely silos. And I think that just in regards to the digitization of everything since COVID, that is a very loud question for banks of any size of an enterprise-wide enterprise risk, how to facilitate putting those silos together and using the data as a consortium and not specific to different siloed functions.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian, do you have the poll results to share with us?
Let's push the results here.
All right.
So it's a mixed bag. It's a lot of people just simply didn't know how to answer. They weren't sure, which I think is maybe the most honest response. There's so much out there in the cyber threat and fraud, emerging fraud space, that it's hard to know if you actually have the right tools in place. But then actually that was about tied with implementing new solutions. So it's equal numbers implementing new solutions and not sure, roughly. Only about 13% are definitely sure they have the right tools in place.
Interesting.
And another 14% planning to invest. So back to you.
Fascinating. Thank you to everyone in the audience for submitting that feedback. Can we go ahead and share one additional poll question? Then we'll jump ahead to our final section here.
Yes,
the final
let's do it.
Poll, let's see the final poll question around potential obstacles to implementing new tools and new solutions, whether that's budget constraints, regulatory constraint or restrictions, fraud-related losses, integration backlogs, or perhaps an issue may just simply not be a priority for the product team. Looking forward to the audience feedback on that as well. And then let's jump ahead to our final issue here for our discussion this afternoon, and that is with regard to the recent AML reform package that was signed into law very recently. This has been years in the making. I know a lot of work by a number of dedicated, committed stakeholders to this issue. And so it's certainly quite significant, and obviously a key hallmark of this has really been focused on the role of how innovation can be leveraged to strengthen AML on the whole. So would love to hear from everyone, from each of your perspectives, the type of benefits that you envision this reform creating, both for the financial sector, but also from law enforcement perspective. And really, what aspect of this reform measure excites you the most, and do you believe has the greatest potential to drive the most meaningful change? Would love to hear from all of you on that. Jared, do you want to start us off? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Love to. So yeah, we're pretty excited about this from a couple different standpoints. One, for us specifically, I've already mentioned, cryptocurrency becoming and continuing to be a main focus for our agency. And in the specific proposal, it really outlined adding substitutes of currency, so including cryptocurrency in a lot of the regulatory aspects. So that, from our standpoint, provides a lot of authority in terms of, our legal ability to go after criminals, incorporating that into some of our jurisdiction when we're talking about statutes, criminal statutes. So that certainly helped in terms of our ability and what we can do. The other big side of it is, you've already mentioned the innovation component, and establishing innovation offices or the analytical hub through FinCEN and some of these other subcommittees that they're going to be focused on establishing. We're already involved in a lot of those, and we're partnering with Treasury and several of the other agencies to really enhance our abilities when it comes to innovation. And we're doing a lot in that aspect. We're looking at setting up a new center, a collaboration and data center that's going to be from our agency. I'm leading this effort to set it up to bring in a lot of the other federal agencies around innovation in the crypto space specifically. But it'd be pretty good because, terrorism financing is another component there. That's a national security priority for all the agencies, making sure we have a handle on how these technologies are coming into play, especially in those type of threat vectors. One of the great things that, as you were talking about SARS and the information contained in that, and I think Karen alluded to some of this, we're actually we're working with some of the great innovation groups, from a government sector, the DARPAs and IARPAs of the world, around machine learning and AI to actually bring in a lot of the SAR data in more of the true data elements and broken down into the smallest aspects of all of that data being able to be brought in and crossed against everything else we have, which in the past, it's been one-off. You receive a SAR, you have humans trying to read it and then maybe trying to OCR it or bring in the data points into their individual siloed data sets. That's all changing, and it's exciting because we're finally, I think, using the technology and really going to that public-private partnership of innovation and analytics. So super excited, and we'll see what that kind of drives in the future.
Excellent. No, fascinating. Very, very exciting times indeed. Look forward to learning more about all of these initiatives. And Karen, would love your thoughts on this as well. I know this is a big development for the financial sector too.
Yeah. So naturally, anything that we could give law enforcement and anything that's providing us that push, I guess, kind of echo what I've been saying from before, to have the capability that's required for lack of better words, would help on the fraud aspect as well. And with any of those, really today, talking about cybercrime, transaction crime, everything together, the line between AML and fraud is beyond blurred. It's relatively overlapped, and it's all the same field at this point. And so, it's been, I think it was 2001, the last time that they did a reform to this extent. And if you think of innovation and how payments have changed in 20 years, money laundering isn't just Ozark anymore. It's not just Ponzi schemes. And I think and hope that this will really open up the opportunity to for banks to understand the need to file on more than just, for example, cash transactions. So as Jared was referencing, how cryptocurrency has really been a focus of this, but also a focus within the past couple of years, but now spelled out relatively and defined more like, hey, this is, I don't want to say a problem, but, you know, this needs to be looked at more. But I think that there's also a little gap that's missing that I'm assuming will close eventually. But the amount of laundering from fintech apps in and out of card rails that will ultimately get into the cryptocurrency scene. So, I mean, we have to file when we see a customer depositing or withdrawing $10,000 in cash. But if you get $10,000 in network transfer credits from a card into your account, and then within seconds it leaves, that's not necessarily like defined as something that we should be filing. If you've detected that, then yes, please and thank you. But I think that we, as just the United States, needs to, or in the world really, really start pinpointing that the innovation that the fraudsters and the launderers are using needs to be covered in these reforms as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's fascinating perspective. Brian, I know we're waiting on the poll results here. Do you want to share those with us? And then Trevor can weigh in.
Absolutely. Let's push the results here. So what do you perceive as the main obstacle? Budget constraints. Maybe unsurprisingly came in as number one, 52% voting for budget constraints, another 28% on integration backlogs, and regulatory constraint or restrictions, only 13%. Not a priority is about 7% there. So looks like we need to talk to senior management about upping those compliance budgets for our audience out there.
Indeed. Do you want to share the final poll question so we can get that final round of insight from the audience?
Let's push that.
Excellent. Thank you. And then Trevor, welcome your closing thoughts on the AML reform developments, and we'll turn it back to Brian to close us out.
As Jared and Karen said, the innovation priority is huge, and hopefully it will provide a framework that will be able to support the rapidly changing use cases and technology we've seen and anticipate, or can't even anticipate. But the accurate and reliable data that hopefully we start putting into the systems as a result of the direction that's given will lead to more meaningful and actionable data for law enforcement to respond to this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Brian, I'll turn it back to you for the poll results.
All right, let's check the last questions results here. So again, not sure coming in very highly, which I think is again maybe not a shock given some of what we talked about here and the tendency in the industry to maybe be a little bit behind on incorporating some of these data signals. So 57% not sure, 16% device information, 15% are getting some of that multi-source geolocation data beyond GeoIP, and only about 6-7% biometrics there.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I realize, unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time. I know there are a few audience questions we weren't able to get to, but I appreciate everyone raising those, and I see some have shared their email. We will certainly circle back with responses to any questions that we weren't able to get to. And just want to thank all of our panelists. Really appreciate your insight, your perspective, everything that you shared this afternoon. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank everyone in our audience for joining us. And I will turn it back over to Brian to close us out here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And a big thanks again to all of our panel. A big virtual round of applause to everyone for the time and the insights. It was really, really a great discussion. And as mentioned at the outset, this is a topic that I think will remain relevant for the foreseeable future and far beyond. So for all those whose questions we were not able to address, we did capture questions. We will try to share them back with our presenters and get a chance to answer hopefully sometime in the near future. In terms of next steps, if you are an ACFCS member, this session will be available to you on the ACFCS site along the recording of the session, along with your certificate of participation. Sign in on acfcs.org and you'll be able to view it there. Please do take a moment at the end of this session to fill out the survey. It should pop up automatically when this session closes out. If not, you'll see a little row of icons at the bottom that looks like 3 dots. There's a little row of icons. There's one that looks like 3 dots, like a little bullet point list. If you click that, the survey will be there. Please do take a moment to fill that out. Let us know your thoughts, feedback, and suggest topics you'd like to see for future sessions. And join us again. We have a lot of great webinars coming up. Hopefully we will partner with GeoGuard for another session and continue this conversation. But you'll find those all, again, acfcs.org under the training section and live webinars. Be able to view the calendar there and register for others. So again, thanks to everybody for the time and attention, and thanks to our panel for the insights today. And with that, we'll close it out. Have a great afternoon and a great rest of the week. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks, man.